I thought I'd open by telling a little bit of the story of the book and some of what inspired me to write it. There are lots of versions of this story, many that begin in my own childhood. This one came from an experience I had as a parent in June 2018. Sitting in our car after a music lesson, my then 6-year-old asked me about a yard sign that had been hung up across the street, protesting family separation at the US-Mexican border. We had had conversations like this before, primarily about police violence. These are conversations that might be called too adult. To answer this child's question, what does family separation mean, would potentially traumatize them, exposing them to something they are imagined not ready for. By this logic, rather than answer their question, I should protect my child from these realities. These are judgments that have and will be made from the outside about such a conversation, but only because this particular child is white. For thousands of children in cages, the children at the center of this conversation, there's no such time of being not ready. Who gets to be imagined as not ready for the so-called adult world of rising fascism, perpetual capitalist crisis, and climate catastrophe? This is precisely the question of who gets to have a childhood in the first place. Yet under the protection of childhood, even the lucky few exist with limited rights while beholden to the private family, the scene of most child abuse around the world. While grappling with these questions of the child as a political concept, I was also reflecting on the day-to-day challenges of trying to parent in solidarity with the child the world calls mine. Whether or not to have conversations about the world was the easy part, how to have those conversations continues to be much more complicated. So that year, 2018, between May and June alone, there were 2,500 children separated from parents and caretakers at the border. And images like this from a facility in McAllen, Texas, were circulating everywhere. Blurry, caged, covered in aluminum blankets on the floor, these children became global symbols of Trump's fascism. Jeff Sessions likened them to smuggled drugs. Quote, "If you are smuggling a child, then we will prosecute you, and that child will be separated from you as required by law. If you don't like that, then don't smuggle children over the border." At the time, liberal discourse focused on the ways these children were being dehumanized, more specifically, how they were not recognized as children and therefore as innocent. Yet even in speaking up for the humanity of these children, extending the logic of childhood as a form of protection, mostly experienced by white children, these children were everywhere in the political landscape, reduced to a mere idea. They were a faceless mass behind the cages. So in August that year, I wrote an essay for Blind Field, what I described at the time as, quote, "some notes written in a moment of urgency when the idea of children demands more rigorous consideration." My goal was not to offer a complete analysis, but to provoke an intervention. The essay explores different ways that children have been instrumental to the moralistic rhetorics of the Christian right and liberalism. It considers childhood as a fantasy structure of white supremacy in the private family, to which actually existing children have varying degrees of proximity. This is how some children, but not others, are protected by notions of innocence and purity. And while often counterposed, Christian right and liberal discourses both draw from this same fantasy structure. However, the intervention of the essay was not about Christian right or liberal imaginaries of the child, but about what I observed as an uncritical adult supremacy on the left. For the most part, I argued, quote, "We have left children to be the concern of the fascists and liberals." This was not happening just at the level of ideas and political debates, but in our political organizing and struggles. In the essay, I wanted to address not just how we talked about children in our political conversations, but how we put our politics into practice with children. At the time, I knew of hardly any political organizing spaces that had childcare. If they did, it was probably in the form of a plastic bin of crayons and construction paper. More likely than not, in Santa Cruz, where I lived at the time, if there was childcare as a part of a political organizing space, it was because of me or one of the few others who had made sure of it. Sometimes making sure of it meant feeling like an inconvenience to others or a nag. These are some of the ways that caretakers, in de-isolating themselves and insisting on solidarity, can experience political organizing. However, even in the best scenarios, if children are imagined as a part of our political world at all, it is often through a model of inclusivity, which my essay also wanted to interrogate. My child was often, quote, included in meetings, sitting beside me or my partner, doing their best to listen and follow the discussion. What we are asking children to do in these scenarios of being, quote, included is to act as best they can like adults. While there are certainly many contexts in which this kind of inclusion seems like a huge improvement in an opportunity for children who might be interested or have access, this is unfortunately too much of the time the limit point for children's participation and active involvement. The essay ends by asking, how do we rethink the adult-child relationship as one of mutual care and learning? How do we take up the challenges of comradeship without leaving the concept of childhood unquestionably defined by capital? So the book opens with an account of various aspects of what I describe as a world against children, our contemporary political landscape, for which these are some of the key features. As I suggest, this world against children is, quote, not a hatred of children, though hatred of children is certainly an aspect of it. Even in its idealization of children, this world is against children. While it may idealize some children, it harms all children. It is a world that day by day renders their future more apocalyptic, and in which they are taught day by day that this is just inevitable. We make this hell normal, knowing that children will most likely live out something far worse, the terror of which we can only begin to recognize. We encounter this world against children in glimpses everywhere. It's in the endless documentation of genocide in Palestine. It's in the ever-worsening conditions of climate catastrophe, which young people in this world are left to inherit, and for which young people are among the most concerned and most impacted in terms of mental health and more. It's in the erosion of social resources for childcare, education, medical treatment, the care crises of neoliberal privatization that harms children and dependents and worsens the working conditions of caretakers. It's in the child abuse we know to be omnipresent, yet which hides in the form of the private family. It's in the reality of the most dangerous physical labor across the world being performed by children. It's in the fascist fixation and targeting of trans children as the key figure of moral panic to the social order of the white heterosexual family. It's in the groomer panic which endangers queer people doing anything to show up for children, like reading stories at the library, but which fails to account for the rampant pedophilia and child sexual abuse unleashed by things like the Epstein files. It's in the hatred of students who are continually scapegoated in national discourse as naive snowflakes, if not hysterical subjects, while being far and above the most organized force in fights for a free Palestine and much else. And it's in the generational conflicts which seem to reinvent themselves each week, but always with the same purpose of shaming younger people, adults included, for all manner of things, for spending all of their money on lattes, for not reading books anymore, for cheating on their essays, for not having enough sex, etc. My interest here is in describing a social totality. Adult supremacy provides a particular framework for understanding how the capitalist world is organized. It is not the only form of power, of course, but it is among the most naturalized, if not the most. Even in the most radical, abolitionist, anti-racist, and feminist spaces, this particular form of supremacy remains often intact. The adult-child relationship is simply the natural order. As a social totality, adult supremacy contaminates everywhere and everyone. And I think in recognizing it as something none of us are exempt from, that we make the first step towards finding solidarity. Adult supremacy is where we live, work, organize. It's wherever we find power. So in writing against this social totality, I approach solidarity with children as an epistemological problem. The political project of the book is to make solidarity with children thinkable in a world where it is profoundly unimaginable. Many books on the topic of children are written from a different vantage, many of which have been valuable resources to me, like radical parenting books or social justice teaching books, which, however framed through expertise, offer practical guidance. Some books in these genres are much more programmatic and problematic. Like self-help books, they're often compelled by a false promise that in the absence of a broader social transformation, so solidarity with children can still be possible. It cannot. This is not to say we don't catch glimpses of this solidarity all the time. It's a sense of possibility I have often felt in spending time with young people, but it's a sense of possibility always under threat. So in pursuing this problem of thinkability, it was important to me to write this book as a long-form essay and to ask questions of genre throughout. Forgive me, the writing instructor in me will now put her hat on, but the root of the essay, estranged so profoundly from the standardized thesis-driven 5-paragraph form of high school English classes, is the French essay to try. This genre, to me, seemed the proper orientation to take towards solidarity with children as a horizon of thought and possibility. Only somewhat in jest, I eventually re-articulate the genre of the book as science fiction in order to frame solidarity with children more explicitly as a utopian problem, a site of speculation and experimentation. While I offer some historical examples and reflect on questions of practice, I tried to model a particular political orientation towards these examples as partial openings to the conditions of possibility for solidarity. We learn more from failed attempts, I think, to enact solidarity with children than from devising more and more programs and blueprints. Solidarity with children is both a utopian problem and a utopian demand, what Kathy Weeks describes as, quote, a political demand that takes the form not of a narrowly pragmatic reform, but of a more substantial transformation of the present configuration of social relations, end quote. All utopian demands, that is, present utopian problems. The purpose of a utopian demand is to provoke more than to succeed, stirring up questions, troubling the status quo, and bringing other possibilities into clarity. So in the last part of my presentation now, I wanted to move from school and to return to questions I asked earlier, which catalyzed this project for me. How do we rethink the adult-child relationship as one of mutual care and learning? And how do we take up the challenges of comradeship without leaving the concept of childhood unquestionably defined by capital? In the book, I make the case that in order to discover this, or what solidarity with children might be, what we really need to do is this other thing, which is abolish adulthood. In my last chapter, I look at adult supremacy as a pervasive form of anti-utopianism, which harms all of us, not just those who are called children. I'll read here from another excerpt. The ideology of no alternative is all that matters. It has little correspondence with the legal limits of adulthood. Children today are often just people who are younger than you, or perhaps just people who are lefter than you. Even among themselves, adults are relentlessly pitted against each other as more and less adult, as in more and less precarious. In this toxic culture, whether one is employed, insured, partnered, familied, and so on, comes to measure one's adult status. We talk around, but never quite through, the mundanity of capitalist crisis and generational conflicts. My generation came of age, one might say, during the 2008 financial crisis. And since then, we have been derided for the immaturity of our financial decisions. For instance, our penchant for lattes and avocado toast, which has single-handedly prevented us from getting out of student debt and affording a mortgage. It will always be easier to blame a younger generation than it is to imagine an end of capitalism. Quote, millennials don't have one thing to protest, we have a whole way of life, as journalist and critic Malcolm Harris suggests, reflecting on Occupy Wall Street as, quote, an attempt to protest the whole not. In Kids These Days, which tells the history of the making of millennials, Harris defines generations as a form of crisis. Quote, Wars, revolutions, market crashes, shifts in the mode of production, transformations in social relations, these are the things generations are made of. While these crises are continual, the idea of a generation creates social divisions that obstruct solidarity, which enables us to endure this relentlessness. Generations, quote, look at each other not over a line, but over a gap, as Harris puts it. And the divisions are very real, even as they're also imaginary. Child liberation refuses these divisions. If the crises are ongoing and shared by all of us, then we will need multi-generational struggles and also non-generational thinking in order to meet them head on. What would it take to engage with generations, not as a source of division, but as a horizon? This entails plunging into the word, generation, to generate, as in bring forth, precisely as a utopian problem. Quote, utopia lies at the horizon, writes Uruguayan author Eduardo Galeano. When I draw near it by 2 steps, utopia retreats 2 steps. If I proceed 10 steps forward, it swiftly slips 10 steps ahead. No matter how far I go, I can never reach it. What then is the purpose of utopia? It is to cause us to advance, end quote. This is the utopian horizon of APLS, an ongoing transformation which, as such, defies the idea of adulthood. What a terrorizing idea this is, that this is the culmination of childhood, a state of non-progression, stasis, and supposed maturity. In itself, adulthood is a false promise of eventual security one might achieve through hard work and discipline. We know that in this world, very few of us actually achieve that status. But in grappling with this question, how do we rethink the adult-child relationship? We quickly encounter what shuts down such utopian inquiry. So the last portion I'll read is from this, thinking about the pathologization of utopian thought. The utopians have always been maniacs and oddballs, as Frederick Jameson reminds us, which can be, quote, readily enough explained by the fallen societies in which they had to fulfill their vocation, end quote. Utopian thought is foolish. It is a matter of fooling around, sometimes tragically. Utopia is also a childish thought, where childishness is understood as a kind of madness. For Ernst Bloch, who dedicated much of his philosophical life to this madness and methods, utopian inquiry, quote, slips off the rails in a paranoid way, indeed almost voluntarily succumbs to delusion. Bloch conceived of this as a practice first learned in childhood with daydreaming. Unlike the night dream, the daydream is participatory. It can be cultivated. And while the night dream exists in a repressive past, where, as Freud maintains, we find the child and the child's impulses still living on, the daydream takes its concern in a quote, as far as possible unrestricted journey forward, Bloch writes, through images of a not yet that are, quote, fantasied into life and into the world. In Cruising Utopia, queer theorist Jose Esteban Munoz elaborates on Bloch's utopian daydreaming as a form of collective temporal distortion, and not yet that, quote, approaches like a crashing wave. We might also think through this distortion as what Elizabeth Freeman calls temporal drag, a not now existing, quote, less in the psychic time of the individual than in the movement of time of collective political fantasy, end quote. Between these variations of the not yet and the not now, I want to stretch towards the question of childish time as a way to theorize childish utopianism. How might we pursue child liberation as a way of messing with, distorting, and even taunting the tyranny of adult received through a language of growth and delay? We tend to think vertically about childhood as growing up. Of this movement, marriage, work, reproduction, and the loss of childishness, queer theorist Catherine von Stockton calls us into, quote, notions of the horizontal, what spreads sideways or sideways and backwards, more than a simple thrust towards height and toward forward, end quote. To engage with the question of the child is to, quote, climb inside a cloud, as she imagines it. It is an act that leads us, quote, in moments to cloudiness and ghostliness surrounding children as figures in time. Perhaps what I've been conjuring here is a cloud then, more than a science fiction. Clouds accumulate, then diffuse. Clouds drift like daydreams. If only for a moment, a cloud blocks the sun. Childish time is fleeting, playful, queer, sideways. It takes hold of the present, but never forever. And yet it always comes back. It might arrive as a jolt to the senses, temporarily disturbing the ways things appear to always be. It might be messy and sometimes murky. But none of this is to suggest that child liberation can't also be made concrete. Before turning to the question of practice, however, I want to stay with this childish utopianism as a way towards solidarity with children. Childish utopianism can help us to dream and to understand dreaming as a way of knowing. Here we might look to what Hortense Spillers calls self-knowing, an ethical practice she derives from reflections on childhood. For Spillers, self-knowing is about the possibilities of childish time, moving, quote, back in the direction of a prior moment in order to move forward with another set of competencies that originate, we might say, in the bone ignorance of curiosity, the child's gift for strange dreams of flying and bizarre, yet correct notions about the adult bodies around her. This knowing state of strange dreaming does not have to end in the way that childhood supposedly does. How many of us roam through the world in this state, its own kind of madness, of knowing that the world could be otherwise? I see this childish utopianism as an integral part of any project of solidarity, however explicitly framed in relation to young people. Part of what we're doing in our political struggles is finding ways to inhabit this alternate temporality collectively, a time where other worlds are possible, and perhaps more importantly, where the one in which we inhabit is not simply an inevitability. This fleeting, playful, queer, sideways temporality and strange state of dreaming creates new ways of knowing ourselves and knowing each other. When I ask how many of us go about our day-to-day lives in this state of madness, of being aware on some level that we could change the world if only we knew how to try for it, I know that is most of us. We are all carrying this around with us wherever we go, and we often have to bury it just to survive, that is, to seem like one of the grown-ups. It seems to me the only way we can know how to change the world on any scale is by learning about this childishness in each other. And while that may sound silly, there's actually nothing scarier to do with other people. It involves a level of vulnerability and not knowingness that this adult world just won't stand for. Child liberation is often dismissed, not just for these ideological adultist reasons, but for a very practical reason, a line of reasoning clearly based in experiences of caring for children. What I hear time and time again, speaking about child liberation with adults who truly want to be down, is that children depend on adults to care for them. From birth, as we all know, humans are far more dependent on care than other animals. I completely understand this question. Children not only need care, but very often, and some more than others, they also need forms of intervention for the sake of basic safety. I see a very young one with us now who speaks to this point. But how is that different from any of us? Don't we all depend on each other? However much that dependence is organized in capitalist life through service work, the family form, and privatized care. Young children are in general more dependent on care, but there are many of us in this world, perhaps legally defined as adults, who require just as much, even if we don't get it. Again, the possibility of child liberation demands a dismantling of adulthood, this notion that at some point we stop depending on each other. So I don't mean to dismiss this concern over children's dependence at all, but to look at what it symptomatizes. I think this concern elicits two questions, which I'll close with. Why is dependence imagined to be in contention with our liberation? And how do we make dependence instead a way of building solidarity? Thank you.